My name is Katelyn, and my pronouns are they, them. I have to admit, I'm quite terrified to be here preaching for the first time, but I'm also excited. The passage we heard today is really important to me, and I can't believe I get to talk about it. I would argue, in many ways, the Bible as a religious text is most interested in asking some very simple questions, two of these being, who belongs to God, and who does God belong to? This question is asked over and over again, beginning in Genesis, and this story of a slave impregnated by her master and then cast out into the desert due to his wife's jealousy takes place in the midst of one of the most pivotal sections of the Old Testament, the covenant between Abraham and God. Now, the way this sermon series has been organized means that we're actually jumping back in time. Months ago, we heard the story of Abraham being asked to sacrifice Isaac, but here in this story, Isaac hasn't even been conceived. Here we are in Genesis 16, and 2 chapters later is when Sarai receives a promise from God that she will give birth in spite of her old age. But here and now, the context is different. In Genesis 12, we see the call of Abram, when God promises him that his descendants will be a great nation and the entire world will be blessed through him. And then we see Abram travel around Egypt and Canaan, lie to survive, quarrel with his nephew, build altars to God, receive blessings. And then in Genesis 15, Abram questions God how he's even going to receive these promised future blessings since he's childless. And God assures him that his heir will be his own flesh and blood, and goes even further than that, telling Abram that his descendants will be slaves in Egypt and suffer for generations before they're able to receive the blessing of land that God is promising them. It's a pretty momentous moment. We've seen God make promises before this, but the circumstances have always been different. The promises to Adam and Eve and to Cain, to Noah and his family, are promises that affect all of humanity at the time because there's not that many people on the planet. This covenant is different. It's a landmark moment where God singles out one person and promises special treatment to his family and descendants, although it does promise overflow blessings. But this raises some obvious questions about the covenant. The main one being, why on earth does God choose Abram? We've certainly seen him, and will go on to see him, being faithful to God, acting heroically, doing noble things, but we've also seen him doing questionable things. We've seen him lie, causing strife for those he lied to, and when God is giving the covenant to Abram, he talks about how the land his descendants will go on to occupy are currently being occupied by sinful people, which seems to imply that Abram's descendants will be less sinful and more worthy somehow. And anyone paying attention to this sermon series will know that Israel, the descendants of Abram, are not somehow uniquely sinless or pious and more deserving of the covenant. So that brings us to this passage, where right after God covenants with Abraham, Abram chooses to act on that covenant in a horrible way that does not seem befitting, to me at least, of God's chosen people. This passage begins by establishing that Abram's wife, Sarai, has a slave, incredibly casually. She had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Thus far, when talking about Abram's household, it's referred to his men, Abram and his people, or a servant in his household becoming his heir. You could be forgiven, I guess, for thinking that maybe Abram is running some sort of commune, a household of allies. But this passage firmly establishes Abram as a patriarch, a master of the house, a man with possessions, and some of these possessions being people. This is how you accumulated wealth in the ancient world. It's difficult to apply 21st century moralities to this story, or to Abram, even thinking about it in comparison to the New Testament, and Jesus emphasizing God's love for the least of these. It's hard to swallow God giving so much favor and promise to a man who goes around accumulating wealth and wielding power over others. I will say, in this story, it's Sarai who comes off worse than Abram does. She's bitter and spiteful. She offers up her slave as if she is breeding cattle, and Abram goes along with it. Reading the promise God made to Abram just 1 chapter ago, telling him that his descendants will be slaves in Egypt, maybe Abram chose to interpret that his son and heir will then be the child of an Egyptian slave, which doesn't make anything that is done here any better, but it does challenge the traditional reading of this passage, that Abram's mistake in fathering Ishmael is that he didn't trust God enough to provide for him. Ishmael is not the result of Abram deliberately going against God in terms of covenant. Anyway, the story goes on. Hagar becomes pregnant and begins to despise Sarai, pretty understandably. And Sarai, upset at the hatred of a person she has enslaved, and given to her husband to bear a child for her, responds by placing the blame on Abram and getting permission from him to wield her power over Hagar and mistreat her. And then Hagar, pregnant, mistreated Hagar, flees into the desert. And even though I know how the story ends, I'm always cheering for Hagar here, so glad for her to be able to escape the misery she was in. Yes, she's alone, pregnant in the desert, but she's free. And then God sends an angel to her and tells her to go back. Mixed feelings. It's uncomfortable to see Hagar being told to return to punishment and mistreatment. And again, I know how this story ends. She will not be protected, and when Isaac is born, she and her son will be cast out into the desert again and expected to die. But also, I have to believe that God sends her back not because they approve her suffering, but because Hagar and her baby would likely have died in the desert, as they expect to in Genesis 21. The angel asks Hagar, "Where are you going?" which convinces me that this is the main element of God's intervention. And it's upsetting, the thought of having to go back to an abusive environment for survival. And reading it makes me think of myself and every queer friend I have that has been forced to stay in an environment where they're mistreated by family members or housemates, and mainly due to the threat of homelessness. I'm well aware that sometimes there are only bad choices. But thankfully, the angel hasn't just been sent to Hagar to order her back to her abuser, but also to make a covenant with her, which is groundbreaking stuff. This Egyptian slave is the only person not in the Abrahamic family line, stretching back to Noah, to get anything like this. God promises her that her descendants will be numerous, just like Abram's, and that her son's name will reflect that her misery was heard by God. Hagar agrees to go back, and there at that spot, she does something also completely unique to the Bible. She gives God a name, Elroy, God who sees me. Hagar goes home, she gives birth, and the rest of her life is by no means easy, but there is hope, and her encounter with God in the desert seems to be that source of hope for her. Her son Ishmael is not the heir of Abram's covenant, but he is heir of Hagar's covenant with her God, Elroy. The fact that Ishmael is given the name that God gave to her implies that Abram listens to her and respects her name suggestion for their son. In the next chapter, Abram will hold up Ishmael for blessing. Hagar and Ishmael will be cast out into the desert in 13 years' time, but they do survive due to God's grace and encouragement. Hagar finds a wife for Ishmael in Egypt, and their descendants do become a great nation. By some accounts, Ishmael is the father of Islam and the ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad. And most tellingly, the wellspring where Hagar met the angel/the Lord bears the name Bir Lahai Roy, or Well of the Living One Who Sees Me, meaning that Hagar's story is told and is given importance, a landmark is named for her experience, and the story is well known enough that the author of Genesis knows of it. I wish that Hagar did not have to endure what she did, be used and abused by these people. But to think of her in the desert, alone and afraid, and then being visited by God, and the course of her life changed by encouraging words so much that she felt seen, that's really special to me. I'm sure many of us understand what it's like to suffer and feel alone, and I hope that many of us also know what it means to feel seen, whether by a friend, a stranger, or even by God. Going back to the start, if this story begs us to ask the question, who does God belong to? The answer is not the wealthy and influential. God made a covenant with Abram, but Hagar is the one who gives God a name and has her own covenant with them. God is not someone who upholds only patriarchs and lets them act without consequence. God sees the outcast and the misery of the foreigner and the mistreated and shows mercy, uplifts them. Something that I've personally come to believe about the Bible, especially in terms of contradictory passages or concerning ideas in there, is that God meets people where they are. And so not everything in the Bible is prescriptive, but it's looking for that through line, those ideas that are consistent throughout the Bible, that can teach us who God really is and maybe how we should be. Hagar's story is the reason that the gospel has been good news for so long and continues to resonate with people and transform their lives. If the gospel was just good news for people in power, for people like Abram, then it would be nothing at all. Just another tool of oppression, propping up people who treat others like Abram and Sarai treated Hagar and her unborn child. Instead, the gospel has flourished over and over again in spaces where empires have used the Bible to justify their mistreatment of others. There are countless stories throughout history where people being oppressed by Christian empire, like Hagar, have then turned around and found God in spite of it all, such as First Nations people in missions in Australia or black slaves in America. Like Hagar, these people looked at the mistreatment of those doing it to them in God's name and were able to go, I know the God who you claim to serve, and I know that that God desires my liberation. It's impossible for me to read stories in the Bible that draw attention to the land and history without thinking about Palestine as well, without grieving for the land and its people. This story, which is relevant to all three Abrahamic religions, speaks so loudly to our God who sees the suffering of the oppressed, especially by those claiming their rights as God's people. It would be remiss for me to talk about God's people and their wielding of oppression without talking about justice and that God sees every person in Palestine who is starving and mistreated as Hagar was, all the babies like Ishmael. And I pray that God can sustain them like they sustained Hagar, but more than that, I pray for intervention, that we will not stand by listlessly like Abram, upholding violence and oppression, but that we can all do everything we can to put pressure on those in power to bring about justice and deliverance for the people of Palestine. El Roi, the God who saw Hagar, is the same God that would later be heralded Emmanuel, God with us. And God's compassion for the vulnerable is central to both their covenant with Hagar and the gospel of Jesus. There's so much more in this passage that could cover tens of sermons. There's things I could say about patriarchy in biblical history, sexual exploitation, the comparisons between Ishmael, Isaac, Jesus meeting women in similar circumstances in the New Testament, and everything that doesn't quite sit right with this story for me. But as always with the Bible, I'm continuing to wrestle with the difficult things, and I hope that all of you can too, and gain wisdom and encouragement. The simplest takeaway from this passage is that, like with Hagar, God sees us even in our worst moments and is with us even if we have to go back to bad places. And if our question is, who belongs to God? And the answer is that actually both Abram and Hagar were favored and blessed by God, what does that mean for our faith? How does this affect the way we act, how we live out our faith? Similar to our response to Jesus' ministry, perhaps, that if God reaches out to the vulnerable and oppressed with mercy and promises great things, then we should do the same. And